In the beginning, there was the land. Great sections of it, boundaried by the two great rivers. For eons inhabited by great Indian nations, the Sac, Fox, Choctaw, and Sioux. Now, to be changed forever.
The deeds of the first settlers who came to the bottomlands of the territory, now embraced within the boundaries of Lincoln County, and made for themselves homes and habitations, cannot be too well remembered, and their history cannot be too often told. The achievements of those who came, their personal histories, what they have wrought, the schools they established, the churches, the towns and cities they built, the battles they fought, should be known and remembered.
Well, hello there. I'm Coonskin Cody. And with the help of Dwayne Whiteside and that sweet little girl Chelsea Crow, me and Homestead Hilda, that's my bride, are going to tell you the story of Troy. Yes, I've been around since Troy began over 175 years ago. Well, on July 4, 1799, I saw Christopher Clark ride his horse into this county and drink right here from this spring. And in 1832, I saw the construction on Britton House, which is now the oldest home in Troy. And in 1896, I was there when Julius Heckler first started Heckler Hardware and is the finest and oldest continual family business in Troy.
Coonskin! Coonskin! Where is that man? That lazy old man is either hunting or fishing. I swear when I need him, he's never around, and when I don't need him, here he comes tracking up my clean floors. Coonskin, where are you? Oh, there you are. Where have you been?
Homestead, look on over there.
Oh, mercy me. Howdy, folks.
Hilda, darling, we're here to tell these fine folks about Troy's rich heritage and its proud history. And like I was saying, I was there when Doc Creech delivered his first baby. I saw Bill Hungate in 1950 when the prosecuting attorney's race as he began his long career as a congressman and then later as a federal district court judge. Well, I've even been around for a few of those Bertle murders. I even watched little Fees Kemper grow up to be a fine mare.
Coonskin, you old windbag, let the announcer tell the story.
It was the age of discovery. Columbus had discovered a new world. Spain, France, and England rushed to lay claims to the new continent. In 1763, Pierre Laclede, junior partner in a New Orleans trade company, obtained exclusive rights to the Indian trade from the Spanish government of Louisiana. With a group of about 30 men, Laclede journeyed up the Mississippi River. In February of 1764, he sent 14-year-old Auguste Chouteau to lay foundation for a trading post. Laclede chose to name the post St. Louis, after Louis IX, patron saint of Louis XV, King of France. The Treaty of Paris, 1763, ended the French and Indian War and terminated the claims France had on Canada and lands east of the Mississippi River, except the port of New Orleans. Secretly, at this time, France transferred lands designated as Louisiana to Spain. Now, suddenly, American and French inhabitants of the territory were subject to Spanish control. Fur trading was the main industry, and an empire of fur was developing in the West. Land in and around St. Louis was free to Americans, and Spanish officials exercised few restraints on these new settlers. Conditions were ripe for Western migration. By the 1790s, Americans were crossing the Great River, bringing their families from Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and the eastern seaboard. One of these first settlers was Warren Cottle, a shopkeeper from Woodstock, Vermont. Cottle was in ill health and decided to seek a warmer, drier climate. It was to St. Louis that Warren Cottle moved in 1798. Cottle didn't remain in St. Louis very long. He had heard of another settlement just a few miles distance on the banks of the Missouri River called St. Charles. Trappers and huntsmen ranged over a wide district north and west of the settlement. Cottle made excursions into the wilderness in search of a likely home site. He was impressed with the beauty of the area, with its big trees and game, but it was a dangerous country, for any trespassing on this land was certain to be disputed by the Indians who roamed through the area. By 1799, Cottle returned to Woodstock to sell his store and move all of his personal effects to Missouri. His description of the St. Charles territory was destined to influence the lives of many people.
Several months before, Major Christopher Clark, a 33-year-old pioneer, left his home in Kentucky and started toward St. Louis, thence to St. Charles. Clark saddled his horse on the first day of July, 1799. That evening, he camped by the side of an obscure trail, or perhaps it was a buffalo track. Clark was impressed by the many signs of wildlife, by the forests, by the solitude. Clark pushed on into the northwest. He threaded his way through heavy forests. He forded shallow streams. By the end of the second day, Major Clark encountered Indians. These Indians could envision prosperity for anyone courageous enough to settle in this district, for there were many furs to be traded. There was profit to be made by all. The following day, July 3rd, Major Clark moved onward, but he was already convinced that this was the district for him. All that he wanted now was to select a place for a cabin. Thus, on July 4th, 1799, Major Christopher Clark paid his first, but not his last, visit to the gurgling spring that was destined to become the site of Troy, Lincoln County, Missouri. Within a few weeks, Clark returned to his Kentucky home. He packed his family and belongings into a flat-bottomed boat and shoved off from the Kentucky shore onto the Ohio River. Then began the long, hazardous journey down the Ohio and up the Mississippi River.
Meanwhile, Warren Cottle returned to Vermont, sold his store, and prepared to move his family. His brother, Joseph, had listened to the stories about the St. Charles area and decided to accompany him into the new western frontier. Joseph was a deacon of the church. Deacon Cottle, as he was known, was a very kind and considerate person of strong conviction and determination. His resolve to make a better home prompted his decision to bring his family to Missouri. Another interested listener to the stories told by Warren Cottle was a rough-and-tumble pioneer named Zadok Wood. In Woodstock, Vermont, Mr. Wood was a highly respected individual who had married Deacon Cottle's daughter. He was a stonemason by trade, but there was comparatively little work for him in Woodstock, so when the Cottle families decided to leave, Wood took the opportunity to go with him. The families of Deacon Cottle and Zadok Wood placed their belongings in 2 covered wagons and left Vermont early in the year 1801. It was early September when they reached the cabin of Warren Cottle and his son Ira. Winter was approaching when the little caravan arrived at a clearing with the partly finished log cabin of Major Clark. 6 children were playing around that log house.
The Major welcomed his first visitors to the vicinity. He had begun to build a cabin but had lost considerable time due to the death of his wife. Clark had returned to Kentucky to get a slave girl to care for the children. Clark agreed to help Cottle and Woods find a good home site. The Major recalled that on a previous trip he had visited a spring just 3½ miles north of his present home. He suggested that spring as the best home site in the vicinity. A few days later, the 2 wagons, under the direction of Major Clark, rolled up to the sparkling spring that was to become a living part of Troy for generations.
During the next few weeks, the forest rang with the metallic sound of axes cutting trees, of chips falling, of trees crashing to the earth. Logs were dragged to the clearing around the spring, and slowly a cabin began to take form. This was the Cottle House, and it was built just south of the spring. For almost 2 years, the Cottle House served as the residence for the Wood family as well. Zadok Wood, assisted by Joseph Cottle, began the construction of a larger house just north of the spring. It was designed to serve as an inn. Wood envisioned the coming of adventurers, trappers, or other transients that would need shelter. Thus came into existence an institution known as Wood's Inn. In addition to transients, there were permanent settlers coming to this vicinity. The records are filled with many names. The year 1803 seems to be the beginning of the real migration. Interwoven in the vague records are Colonel David Bailey, who became the first sheriff, and Judge John Lindsay. In the following year, Ezekiel Downing, who established the first tannery, was listed. There was Dixon, Null, Allen, Hunter, Collard, Brown, and Miller.
Been wondering while you've been sitting there on your keisters how Troy got its name. Well, I was there, and there was a big town hall meeting, and you had the Woods family wanting to name it Woodstown, and you had the Cottle family wanting to name it Cottleville. Well, as you know, these two families were kinfolk, and they were always feuding, and the townspeople had had their belly full. There was a young merchant there by the name of Joshua Robbins, and he stood up and gave an eloquent speech about his hometown of Troy, New York. The townspeople voted unanimously to name the city Troy, except, of course, for the Woods family and the Cottle family. But then they never got along anyway.
To celebrate. But times were hard and there were many tragedies. One of the first settlers to the area was William McHugh. Mr. McHugh came to this vicinity in 1803. He had 3 sons and planned to establish his home on the outer fringe of the western frontier. Unfortunately, the McHugh family was destined to meet with misfortune. Just 1 year after their arrival, the 3 sons were sent to retrieve some horses. As the boys were returning in the company of an Indian scout named Frederick Dixon, they were ambushed. The 3 boys were slain, but Dixon escaped. This killing was the only slaying by Indians in this vicinity, prior to the War of 1812, of course. It was rumored that the Indian chief Black Hawk led the attack, but it is doubtful that he participated in the incident. The children were probably killed by Indians seeking vengeance on white people in general. The tribe had been disgraced by entering into an elusive treaty with the whites in St. Louis. To avoid being ostracized by their own people, they sought vengeance on the first white person they encountered. Unfortunately, the first white persons were the McHugh children. Tragedy again struck William McHugh a few years later when his wife suddenly died. In 1812, McHugh died of a broken heart.
The previously mentioned treaty is a document which caused a split in the Sac and Fox Indian tribes. It actually led to the power that eventually concentrated in the hands of Black Hawk. Black Hawk seemingly took command of the rebellious group of Indians and severed relations with their less rebellious fellow Indians. Aside from this one violent chapter, the first few years of history in this vicinity were comparatively peaceful. The Louisiana Purchase passed with little fanfare. But the change of ownership to the United States brought an increase in settlers to the area. After the Lewis and Clark expedition, Major Clark returned to the area and remarried. This perhaps being the first marriage performed in the district. The War of 1812 brought unrest with the Indians of the territory. The British enlisted the aid of the Indians, and Black Hawk was given the commission as Brigadier General in the British Army. Indian raids could be expected in Troy, for this was Black Hawk's traditional territory. Settlers began to move to the protection of a barricade that was being constructed around the spring. It was a big enclosure, housing several cabins. This enclosure was to become known as Woods Fort. 25, perhaps 30 families concentrated there during the war. Residents were in constant fear of Indian attack, and the sloping hill to the west was cleared and converted into a communal field. Men worked in this field under the protecting guns of the fort. The arrival of the Rangers under the command of Captain James Calloway, grandson of Daniel Boone, eased the tension somewhat. As winter approached, a second group of Rangers arrived under the command of Nathan Boone. By 1813, another group of horsemen under the leadership of Lieutenant Zachary Taylor, later to become President of the United States, reinforced the garrison at Woods Fort. That same year, 80-year-old Daniel Boone braved the wilderness to aid in the defenses. So it was that many famous and brave men came to the defense of this soil. The war succeeded in slowing the westward march, and ironically, contributed much toward concentrating people at one central location, later to become the present community of Troy.
The county of Lincoln, along with 7 other counties, was organized in accordance with an act of the legislature of the Territory of Missouri passed December 14, 1818. Several names had been proposed for the new county when Christopher Clark arose to address the body.
Mr. Speaker?
Major Clark?
Sir, I was the first man to drive a wagon across Big Creek, and the first permanent settler within its limits. I was born, sir, in Lincoln County, North Carolina. I lived for many years in Lincoln County in Old Kentucky. I wish to live the remainder of my days and die in Lincoln County in Missouri. And I move, therefore, that the blank in the bill be filled with the name of Lincoln.
The motion was carried unanimously. A none too alert clerk scribbled Lincoln instead of Linkhorn, and thus the county was named.
In 1819, the settlers platted Troy to become a city of the state of Missouri. The survey included 200 lots. Its street boundaries included Monroe Street on the south, 3rd Street on the east, Locust Street on the north, and Main Street on the west. At the time, the town spring on the west side of Main Street and a small tract of land surrounding it were donated to the public by Joseph Cottle and his wife, Azuba. In 1829, the question of moving the county seat became an issue. Due to its central location, Troy was strongly favored over other communities. The change had a profound effect on the town. It brought additional businesses, and soon the community boasted 2 general stores, 2 hatters, 2 tailor shops, 1 hotel, 2 blacksmith shops, Horace Wing's tannery, and a few other enterprises. Shortly thereafter, mail was delivered 3 times a week from St. Louis. In 1830, Zadock Wood and several of his sons departed for Texas to assist in her fight for freedom from Mexico. Wood, whose deeds had such a profound influence on Troy, was never to return. In 1832, construction began on what is known today as the Britton House. The home, built in the Federal style, retains its 4 original working fireplaces, 6-panel walnut and pine Christian doors, and hand-hewn random width floorboards. The home cost $1,500 to construct. During the unloading of the limestone block that was to be used for the foundation, a block fell from the wagon, crushing the left hand of a young man. In time, the wound healed, but he was never to have full use of the injured hand. The home was later purchased and restored by Chet Breitwieser and Clay Marsh. The Britton House is the oldest home in Troy. The first organized church, Troy Presbyterian, was established November 26, 1831, by Reverend William S. Lacey and John S. Ball. It had 9 members and met in the old courthouse until a sanctuary could be constructed. This building was used until 1868, when the present structure was built on Boone Street. The first church building was that of the Christian Church, constructed in 1859 and still stands on 2nd Street. In 1849, rumors came sweeping in from the west. Gold had been reported in California, and the rush was on for Easterners to go west to seek their fortunes. The thrill of gold was tingling through Troy, and some individuals hurried to St. Louis to join transcontinental wagon trains. In 1850, 2 brothers, Frank and Walton Perkins, decided to join in the wild scramble for gold. Anyone in Troy or the vicinity who wanted to go was invited to join in the Perkins train. The group which joined marked the largest number of Trojans to leave for the gold fields. The date, April 8, 1850. There is no record as to the success of this group. Perhaps they struck it rich. History does not say.
Now wait just one dead burn moment. There's more to that story. You see, it just happens that a young man was to return from California, and upon returning, he found that both of his parents had passed away, leaving a sizable estate which no one had claimed. Well, he stepped forward to claim his right, but time and life in the wilds of the frontier had done its work, and no one could recognize him to validate his claim. However, fate was on this young man's side. For you see, this young man had previously been employed on the construction of the Britton House. An older gentleman stepped forward and asked to see the hopeful heir's left hand. That gentleman, who had helped to dress and treat the wound, announced that this indeed was the legitimate heir, and the young man was restored to his inheritance and his place in the community.
By 1850, there were ominous rumblings as the cloud of separation and civil disobedience encompassed the land. Great issues were before the nation, and Troy, like so many Missouri communities, was divided in its sympathies. There were slave owners in Troy. At the time, there were a total of 2,500 slaves in Lincoln County. There were also Northerners who had come to Troy, and there was the consequent mixed emotions. To report these events, the first newspaper, the Lincoln Gazette, was established. In 1861, federal authorities forced the paper to discontinue publishing due to its advocacy of the doctrine of secession. It is fortunate for our community today that Marjorie Evans has dedicated her life to preserving the Civil War history of Lincoln County. Her efforts help us tell the story. With the election of Lincoln, Civil War was fast approaching. On that fateful day in 1860, the first shot was fired in Virginia. Domestic conditions had brought on the Great Separation. The dark storm clouds of war, which had been boiling on the southern horizon for years, were at hand. At Fort Sumter, there was the crack of gunfire. Telegraph wires began to hum. The nation was electrified. Armies began to move. The South called to its loyal citizenry, and that call was heard in Troy. Families with deep sympathies for the Southland prepared for the confrontation. 2 Confederate companies were recruited in Troy. There came into being roving bands of desperate men, guerrillas, who follow a pathway of violence under the cloak of fighting for a cause. Strong supporters of the Union were singled out for death by unknown hands that reached out from the darkness. Horsemen rode roughshod over the country. They summoned men from their homes. Shots rang out in the dark, and men were left to die in the nocturnal dust. 12 men were assassinated by night riders in the early part of the war. Organized warfare never touched Troy or Lincoln County, but guerrilla warfare did. A group of Union soldiers, under the command of Colonel John B. Henderson, took command. The soldiers established themselves in Troy and prepared for an eventual siege. A blockhouse was built, but war didn't come. Colonel Henderson's greatest task was to prevent Confederate sympathizers from going south. There were a number of arrests, but to all intents and purposes, Confederate enlistments ended with the arrival of Colonel Henderson, and Troy, like Missouri, remained in the Union throughout the war. Colonel Henderson had been born in Troy, and his success in containing the situation later catapulted him into the United States Senate. When Abraham Lincoln issued his famed Proclamation of Emancipation, it touched the lives of many Lincoln County residents. After the slaves were freed, some moved away, others remained. Many of their descendants still live in Lincoln County.
Troy, like the rest of the nation, felt the depression after war's end. The economic collapse here was not as pronounced as in other sections of the country, partly because Troy was on the fringe of the war. While the Southland was undergoing its era of carpetbaggers and reconstruction, Troy was quickly returning to normalcy. Business gradually improved, crops grew abundantly, and within a comparatively short while, Troy was, once again, a growing, thriving community. In 1869, a German immigrant cabinet maker named Henry Kemper came to Troy. He established himself as the local furniture and cabinet maker and soon erected a large, 3-story building on Main Street. Like many woodworkers of his time, he not only built the furniture, but he also furnished the caskets, and therefore was the undertaker. In 1893, journal records show the Kemper family began the Troy Lumber Company. Today, the company has grown into 3 businesses: Kemper Marsh Funeral Home, Troy Furniture, and Doolin Harrell Lumber Company. They remain the longest continuing businesses in the county. By 1873, there were many new businesses in Troy. There was the Cake and Rogers Tannery, the one which was originally established by Horace B. Wing. The tannery was doing an extensive business and was one of the largest employers in the community. That same year, one of the best hotels in the state, the Laclede Hotel, was constructed. There was the Farmers and Mechanics Bank, retail stores, Crump and Wing, Joseph Hart and Walter Cooper. F.S. Sweeney, G.W. Moore, and M.T. Britton operated grocery stores. The J.P. Lennett Hardware Store, the Henry and Brothers Shoe Manufacturing Company, and Thomas Withrow were manufacturing saddles and harness.
In 1879, a joint stock company known as the Lincoln County Agricultural and Mechanical Fair Association was formed. The purpose of the fair was to sponsor an annual exhibition for the citizens of Lincoln County. A previous attempt for a county fair was made on October 1st, 1856, by the Agriculture and Mechanical Society. However, this group was disbanded 2 years later. The new exhibition was held in the fall of 1880. The fair was an immediate success, and soon an amphitheater with a seating capacity of about 1,000 people was constructed. By 1882, the fair attracted wagons from every direction bearing loads of humanity to watch the horse races. The first 2 days were devoted to livestock judging, and in the ladies' department, needlework, jellies, bread, and ketchup competition. These activities were held at Art Hall, the only original structure remaining. One of the greatest attractions to the early fairs was Miss Rosie May and her double balloon ascension along with her trained dog.
By 1882, there were 6 doctors and 13 lawyers in Troy. New businesses made their appearance during the late 1800s. Baxter Crawford, Woolfolk, Mills, Norton, Stevens, Cooney, Swan, Avery, Trail, Worsham, Cheeley, Clark, Wolfe, Chenworth Ward, Bragg, and Thurman Childers were men helping to make Troy a leading progressive community. In 1882, the railroad came. This made Troy a railroad point town, and perhaps no single event in our history had a more significant impact on the community. The arrival of the St. Louis and Hannibal Railroad brought problems as well as prosperity to Troy. The workmen that built the railroad gave Troy concerns that had never been expected. Those men were the most quarrelsome men who ever were in this vicinity. They spent considerable time in jail. The mayor and city council were forced to take stern measures to keep this rough element under control. The problem was only solved when the railroad was completed. On May 2nd, 1882, a train was organized for the first trip to Hannibal to see the Sells Brothers Circus.
On September 1st, 1887, there was a series of fires. The Jackson property caught fire on that day, destroying several buildings. Just 6 months later, in February 1888, tenants in the Laclede Hotel were awakened early one Sunday morning. Smoke was billowing into the hotel from Thornhill's store on the first floor. Guests jumped from windows in the chilly February wind. They gave the alarm, but the fire had raged unchecked for some time. By the time firefighters were mobilized, Thornhill's store and the Laclede Hotel were converted into a raging inferno that cast a flickering orange glow over the town of Troy. In the late 1800s, Fred Bonfils was born and raised in Troy. As a young man, he left to seek his fortune and later became a wealthy businessman as the owner of the Denver Post newspaper. He also became the owner of one of the largest circus, the Sells Flotto Circus. In 1906, as recognition of his hometown, he brought the circus to Troy. Tradition has it, there were so many train cars transporting the circus that there were not enough sidetracks in Troy to unload the entire troupe, so part had to be unloaded at Moscow Mills and transported to Troy. To meet the demands for cultural and educational activities, Mr. L.J. Henry built a large 2-story building in 1890 to be known as the Opera House. The first floor was used as a business, while the upper floor featured a stage and large auditorium. Stock companies and local talent all played at the opera. Socials, balls, parties, carnivals, bazaars, musicals, stage shows along with dinners and church activities were held. Motion pictures were later shown in the Opera House. The Opera House met Troy's entertainment needs from 1890 until 1919 when it became a garage. Today it is a part of the Main Street business area and reminds us of the rich heritage of the city. 1896, Julius Heckler started the Heckler Hardware Store. The son of German immigrants, he came to Troy in 1885 and started a saddlery and grocery with his brother-in-law, George Kempf. Construction on the current building, with the first of 3 sections, began in 1890. The front of the building is made of cast iron and zinc and was molded by Mesker and Brothers of St. Louis. In the early years, the store was a dealer in John Deere and McCormick equipment, a full line of hardware, housewares, china, buggies, surreys, and they also installed acetylene gas lighting systems in homes and businesses. In 1929, Julius's son, Ernie, took over the business. Ernie was an expert tinner like his father and had a large sheet metal shop. He and his sons installed Lennox furnaces and air conditioning for 40 years. History tells us that during World War II, that due to the shortage of metal, hardware items and toys were unavailable. So the Heckler children brought their own toys to the store so that other children would have toys under the Christmas tree. In 1966, Ernie's son, Robert, bought the business. Today, Robert, along with his sons, Dan and Phil, continue the long tradition of service. Heckler Hardware is the longest continual family-owned business in the community. The store still maintains charm and character with its original floors, fixtures, and nail bins.
In 1904, the world came to St. Louis as the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase was celebrated. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition, commonly called the St. Louis World's Fair, brought millions of visitors to St. Louis. The fair's theme was peace and prosperity. St. Charles and Lincoln County residents crossed the Missouri River on the new St. Charles Bridge, constructed especially for this celebration. Trojans felt particular pride knowing that Major William Clark, Troy's first citizen, had been a partner in the exploration of the Louisiana Territory. Other cultural activities included reading, literature, music activities, and the great automobile tour designed to advertise the annual Lincoln County Fair. Beginning in 1913 and continuing for several years, automobiles lined up on Main Street to parade through the surrounding communities of Moscow Mills and Wentzville. It was a great way to wave to friends and see the newest in automobile engineering. The first Chautauqua was held in Troy in 1913. A Chautauqua was an educational assembly resembling those held at Chautauqua, New York, consisting of lectures, home study, concerts, and so forth. The Chautauqua movement was thoroughly undenominational and non-political, and people of all creeds and parties commingled. Adult and children alike supported this activity, and soon the programs were being held at the fairgrounds to accommodate the large crowds. In 1916, William Jennings Bryan, a famous Democratic figure, prepared a speech, "The European War and the Lessons It Teaches Us," but was sidetracked as he recalled a previous visit where he had enjoyed the refreshing waters from the Troy Spring. The Chautauqua programs were varied and offered a variety of topics and excellent music. In 1929, Chautauqua was held in the newly constructed Bonfils Auditorium. The program was known as the College Circuit. Although the programs were well received, the economic conditions of the 30s made the programs impractical to continue.
The teen years of the century again brought war clouds on the horizon of Europe. Trojans fought in World War I just as they have fought in every war that has ever involved this nation. Shortly after war was declared, Troy mobilized, and when the troops departed, one of the largest crowds in our history was assembled to bid them farewell. Some of these men failed to return. Others returned with brilliant records. But as always, war leaves heroines in that legion of Gold Star mothers, and Troy was no exception. The building boom of the 1920s resulted in the construction of the Oddfellows Addition on the corner of Main and West Cherry, the Dunard Brothers Equipment Building, and Troy's first factory, the Climax Specialty Company, specializing in baby products. The company has changed owners and today is the Continental Textiles Company on West Cherry Street. One of the most interesting businesses established at this time was that of A.A. Kuhn. Mr. Kuhn established Kuhn Brothers Mercantile Company, which included the New York Racket Store, Kuhn's Department Store, a poultry and farm products company, and many other enterprises. Mr. Kuhn is remembered by those who knew him as a man with extraordinary vision. Fires in 1927 consumed the Hannes Troy roller mill, and on the frosty morning of January 1st, 1928, destroyed 5 business houses on the west side of Main Street. Temperatures were 20 degrees below zero when firefighters valiantly fought a losing battle to save the business district. In spite of these disasters, the area has rebuilt, and Troy has remained one of the busiest towns in this entire area.
During the 1920s, a group of farmers met to establish a station for the buying of whole milk. Rural areas did not have electricity and therefore could not cool their product for shipping. The Lang Milk Company of St. Louis proposed the city pass a bond issue to build a processing plant, and soon Troy had 9 local routes for transporting raw milk to this buying station. At first, the milk was transported by train, but later, when Highway 61 was changed, the milk was transported by truck. Difficulty with disposing of the milk waste precipitated the need for a sewage treatment plant. A second bond issue was passed, and a contract was let to construct the system. Work began in August 1928. By November, work had reached the corner of Main and Boone Streets. Rock close to the surface made it necessary to blast. As a result of this blasting, the town spring was disrupted and ceased to function. In an attempt to restore the historic waters, workers dug where the Methodist Church parking lot is today, but they were unable to confine the flow. Gone was the gushing of the cold, clear crystal water. The spring that attracted pioneer families to settle here was lost forever. No more would school children stop on their way home for a refreshing drink, or townspeople gather in the cool shade on a hot summer's evening before drawing their bucket of water. In 1931, a second attempt to locate and confine the spring was made without success.
In October 1929, the New York Stock Exchange failed, and the country was suddenly thrown into bankruptcy. Troy was spared in the first years of the Depression due to the construction of Highway 61, which gave work to many residents. The below-normal rainfall for the years 1934 through 1936 made the economic situation grim. There came a need for government-provided work. In 1932, Franklin Roosevelt was elected president, and he began federal relief programs. WPA, Works Progress Administration, repaired and built roads. CWA, Civil Workers Administration, made available nurses, welfare workers, recreational directors, and home economist instructors to serve towns of the county. One of the most lasting programs for the city of Troy was the construction of the CCC, Civilian Conservation Camp, on the Quiver River, which remains today as a Missouri State Park. The world of aviation came to Troy in the early 1930s when the citizens got an unexpected close-up of this airplane. The aviator made an unscheduled landing in Fairgrounds Pond. In 1938, new right-of-way lights were installed. In the fall of the same year, the city purchased the waterworks from C.P. Tiffany, financed by a PWA grant. Water lines were installed and a new pumper fire truck was purchased to accompany the chemical truck purchased in 1924. For the first time, Troy had protection from the devastating fires that had plagued the area since its founding. The Great Depression continued, and times were hard, but all news from the 30s was not down. Skirts were up 2 inches to show off the new colors in silk stockings.
In economic news, the United Shoe Machinery Corporation constructed a building in the east part of town. Kemper Lumber Company completed plans for a new subdivision located off Harris Street to be known as Buchanan Courts. Financed by FHA loans, the monthly payment on the homes was $20. In April 1941, the Missouri Union Telephone Company constructed a new building for its equipment, and a new switchboard was installed. The days of the crank phone were over. Just lift the receiver, and the operator would say, "Number, please?" In the fall of 1941, Troy held its 140th anniversary celebration. There was a pageant as written by Judge Andy Brown. The pageant was given 3 nights, with admission being 35 cents for adults and 20 cents for children. Woods Fort was recreated and children rode oxen in the parade. And at the time, our own honorary general chairman, Austin Creech, was in charge of the history book. Children of the time still remember the event and have been of great value in organizing the 175th celebration. In 1941, the Quiver River Electric Cooperative was formed. Electricity was available primarily within the city limits of Troy. Rural residents were still without electrical service until a group of neighbors organized the cooperative. For those that cannot remember the good old days, it was quite a trip the first time Grandma said, "Turn on the lights." Another civic improvement was the construction of a playground and park area. Begun in 1943, the city park has continued to grow and improve. Today it features baseball diamonds, picnic tables, a shelter house, which is an extension of the original Art Hall building, lights, tennis courts, soccer fields, and a refreshment stand. The park continues to be a source of pride for the city.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
World War II brought the call to arms to Troy and Lincoln County, and again, Trojans were ready to answer that call. It was a time of defense bonds, scrap iron drives, and rationing. On October 16, 1940, young men between the ages of 21 and 36 had been required to register for the national draft. 1,479 men registered from Lincoln County. The National Lottery determined the men selected to serve. The first draft, all filled by volunteers: Avery V. Reed, Eolia; Bernard I. Bauer of Silex; and Henry A. Spellbrink, Old Monroe. The war effort continued to be the first priority, and fundraisers of all kinds were sponsored. One of the most successful was the crowning of a Victory Queen and a victory concert which netted $53,503.65. Miss Alberta Burkemper of Old Monroe was crowned Victory Queen. The need for workers in the war industries promoted the mobilization of men beyond the military, as well as training women to take the place of servicemen. These programs encouraged Trojans to commute into St. Louis for jobs. This lifestyle continues today, as many follow Highway 61 to St. Louis for work. The war also brought about social change. Women found their place in the workforce, and Rosie the Riveter brought home a paycheck. Music reflected the new attitude of the nation as the big band sound became the rage, and jitterbugs covered the dance floors.
On April 12, 1945, the nation mourned the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 32nd President of the United States. Missourian Harry S. Truman became the 33rd President. On May 8, 1945, at 8 a.m., President Truman proclaimed unconditional surrender of Germany. When the news was received in Troy, the bells of the churches were rung and business houses closed for the remainder of the day. Special VE services were held at each of the churches at 8 p.m. that evening. Japan surrendered just 3 months later, and VJ Day was celebrated with a day of thanksgiving and prayer. The war had ended, but the remembrance for those lost or injured is still celebrated on the courthouse lawn in the eternal flame. In 1946, citizens began a project to bring a hospital to Lincoln County. But it would be 7 years before the Lincoln County Memorial Hospital would officially open its doors. Since that day, April 16, 1953, the facility has treated over 100,000 patients and has become a great source of pride to our community. Much of the success for the hospital can be attributed to the efforts of Dr. Joseph Creech. Dr. Creech practiced medicine in Troy for 40 years, delivering 1,190 babies and earning his place in Troy history as a great humanitarian. Upon retirement, his portrait was hung in a place of honor at the hospital.
Yes, sirree. That Doc Creech, he was just a fine fella. You know, one night, while attending a Corey League baseball game at the city park, someone asked Dr. Creech, "Hey, Doc, how many of those boys out there in the ball field have you delivered?" Well, Doc Creech stood up out of his lawn chair, surveyed the field, sat back down, and with a great pride and outstretched arm gesturing towards the ball field, he said, "I delivered both teams, and their coaches, too."
In 1949, the Rural Volunteer Fire Department was organized. A second truck was purchased, which enabled one engine to remain in the city limits at all times. The decade of the 50s saw few changes in the community. Parking meters were installed along Main Street. During the 50s, daylight savings time, which had been practiced during the war, was implemented, but many businesses refused to observe it. Delivery of the mail to all residents and business houses started on February 16, 1950. All houses had to be renumbered. The Troy and Rural Volunteer Fire Department was organized, and a new fire truck arrived in April 1950. This volunteer unit still serves the Troy area with distinction. In 1955, construction was begun on the new high school and grade school, which was completed in time for the 1956 school year. During the 1950s, many new businesses were started, and economic growth was important, but not at great cost. Two historic landmarks, the H.W. Perkins home on the corner of Perkins and College, and the Old Avery House, also known as the Sally Worsham home, were razed to make way for a subdivision and new development respectively.
Now, no history of Troy would be complete without a history of the school systems. It is first recorded that Minerva Woods, Zadok Woods' wife, taught the children of the first settlers, including her daughter, Little Minerva. The Troy Collegiate Institute was founded in 1882. Because of the special devotion and large gifts given by Mr. Alexander Buchanan, the school was named Buchanan College. In 1905, the college sold its property to the Troy Public School District, and the name was changed to Buchanan High School. Lincoln County did not have a public grade school for the African Americans until 1888. The building of the school was paid by the paycheck sent back home from the Lincoln County African American soldiers of the Civil War. And it wasn't until 1956 that Buchanan High School was integrated, and it was in that year that the new high school was opened.
Troy Public Schools, including Troy Primary and Claude Brown, have enjoyed tremendous success both in academics as well as other school activities. The choral, band, and speech and drama departments have each achieved statewide recognition for their excellence. The Marching Trojans have participated in parades across the nation. The concert choir has also traveled throughout the country, performing for various theme parks and organizations. The choral music department, in conjunction with the theater department, has produced a long string of successful musical theater productions, including Oklahoma, Oliver, My Fair Lady, The Sound of Music, Once Upon a Mattress, Bye Bye Birdie, and Annie Get Your Gun. Many young, talented actresses and actors have passed through our schools. Do you remember Dale Black in The Ladner? Carol Cockrell in South Pacific? Kevin Crofts in The Music Man? Kelly Hendricks in The Wizard of Oz? Jeff and Jeannie Arrigo in several musical shows, as well as a host of other great performers. The community has been culturally enriched by these shows. The FHA chapter has received many awards and was the first chapter to represent the state of Missouri in parliamentary procedure competition. The community has benefited from their many service projects. The Troy Trojans have excelled athletically and are respected as perennial contenders in girls and boys cross-country, track, and basketball. The first boys basketball team to go to state was in 1954. Team players Carter Creech, Jack Brownguard, Bob Dunard, among others, led the team to a third-place finish. Over the years, Troy has had many All-State players, including Robin Wilhoit in 1976, Ronnie Perkins in 1977, Darrell Harkey in 1979, and Mike Adcock in 1983. In the 1980s, Coach Wilkins became the Troy coach and has won an unprecedented 80% of his games, earning the highest winning percentage in the state. Since Coach Wilkins has taken the reins of the Troy team, several more Troy boys have been named to the All-State team. Mike Thornhill, 1985, Kevin Reller, 1986, Brian Hi-Ho Silver, 1988, Shane Capel, 1990, Brandon Scott, 1992, and Kish Lewis in 1994. Trojan basketball maintains great tradition and has earned respect throughout the state. Though our information about the girls' team is limited, in its short history, the Troy girls' basketball team has had outstanding success. Troy girls have made it to the Final Four in the state several times, finishing third place in the state in 1994. The girls' dynasty began with the team's first coach, Ken Hopkins, and continued under the leadership of Ron Wilhoit. Renee Roliardi, an alumnus of Troy, will certainly continue the success as she leads the Lady Trojans starting in the 1994-95 school year. The Troy FFA BOAG department has perpetuated the agricultural traditions of the area and has prepared many leaders affecting this community. In fact, this field where you sit was named after one of the first instructors, Jess Klontz, the old Peckerwood. The Troy chapter is steeped in many fine traditions: chapter officers, barnwarming queens, and contest teams, and has maintained a dynasty over a quarter of a century as champions of the State Fair Farm Mechanics Contest. There have been over 240 state farmer degrees. American farmer degrees include Harvey Martin and David Burkemper. There have been numerous state contest winners and 4 national contest winners, including the 1993 first place parliamentary procedure team at the national level. The Troy chapter can also boast its second state FFA officer, Leah Womack. The FFA chapter, under the instruction of Jim Schultz, Alan Harrell, and Mark Lightman, will continue generating great leaders for our school and community. Troy's educational future looks bright. Its traditions remain strong, as evidenced by the April 5th bond levy election, when patrons of the R3 school district approved, by a nearly 2/3 margin, an 89-cent increase for the construction of a new high school. The project resulted from a recommendation of district patrons developed from a series of public forums conducted in early 1993. Following the election, Superintendent Dr. John Lawrence commented, "It's a celebration for the community, and particularly the students. The people of our community have a right to be very proud. What they voted will greatly benefit not only our children, but our children's children."
Let's join in singing the school song.
Yes, it's sure been our pleasure to tell you the fine history and heritage of Troy. And I have the ability to sight down my trusty musket to tell you the future of Troy. Well, I've done it before. In the 1956 siege, I predicted that Dickie Crouch would run the Cheapskate restaurant. And we all know that when he ran the Dairy Freeze, he whittled his own toothpicks. I also predicted that Gary Hoffman would become a famous deep-sea diver. And we all know that Gary Hoffman has a few fish stories to tell.
Yes, I suspect the Lincoln County Journal will even get a new spell check on their computer.
And I predict that Doc Lawrence will take on an additional job as a stunt double for the Boatman's Guy. Homestead, Hilda, and myself certainly do appreciate you all spending the time with us here this evening. And we look forward for you all joining us all back here in the year 2019 for Troy's 200th anniversary. And everyone remember that the future belongs to those who are willing to care for it.
That's right, Coonskin and Hilda. As we celebrate 175 years of life in Troy, we remember the good times, the bad times, and the ordinary times. Troy has truly left her mark on society and the people raised within her boundaries. It is with fond reminiscing that we look at the past and great optimism that we look at the years to come. As we grow and look to the future, may the city and her people keep the fine traditions begun 175 years ago. In tribute to our city, our people, and our country, please join us in singing America the Beautiful.
Oh, beautiful eyes for amber